And that's how we learned the fire we hid in our bones was never meant to flicker. It was meant to blind gods. If you've stayed with us this far, remember, the night is loud, the dust is hot, and the next choice is the one that counts. Now watch closely. The desert wakes. The spotlights find their mark. The story breathes. The engines cut and the hull stopped shuddering, leaving only a ringing in David's teeth and the sour bite of recycled air. Outside the transport's ramp, a nighttime desert outpost lay bristling with stacked shipping containers, chain-link corridors, and guard towers that swung hard cones of light over a rocky yard scarred by old explosions. Smoke crawled low across the sand like a tired animal. Someone had turned the sky into a black sheet studded with indifferent stars. 3 sentries met him at the ramp with weapons up, but not quite steady, scaly hands twitching on grips as if the triggers might bite back. The big one wore a translator collar that chewed his words into gravel. "Move, human." The way he said human made it sound like a diagnosis. David raised his shackled hands and brought the chains together just loud enough to make the nervous ones flinch. He didn't hurry. The lines on his skin, inkless, dark, and alive under the floodlights, drank the glare and returned it in thin, shifting echoes. The sentries looked the way all off-worlders looked the first time, intrigued, unsettled, trying not to stare. They pushed him through container halls converted into a council detention grid, gray walls, ammonia clean, rumors and fear braided into the recycled air. Cells clung to both sides like metal hive combs, faces pressed to transperisteel to catch a glimpse. Whispers rolled in languages that slipped past David's ear like fish. "What are those marks?" The smallest guard blurted before the leader could shut him down. "A rookie," high voice. "Shoes too new for dust." "Reminders," David said, smiling without showing his teeth. "Of home." That made the rookie stumble. That made the rest tighten their grips. Fine by David, nerves make mistakes. Mistakes open doors. They delivered him to a medical bay cut into the side of a container stack, where cold light made everything look sterilized and tired. The doctor waiting for him was tall and chromium silver, skin catching every photon like a mirror's breath. 4 eyes, each tracking its own curiosity. Her badge scrolled, "Tini, Xenobiology." Her scanner purred like a restrained hornet as she circled him. "Fascinating," she said in crisp standard, not bothering to hide the pleasure of being first. "I've read dossiers on human physiology. I've never examined a living subject." David sat on the table without the ritual of being asked. Chains clinked. "First time seeing the patterns, Doctor?" "They're not tattoos," she murmured, instruments fanning. "Not scarring. Subdermal structuring with bioelectric activity. They respond when you emote." She glanced up exactly as the corner of his mouth moved. Her readouts jumped. "See? Spike." "Mood rings," David said. "Fashionable where I'm from." "Your species doesn't do ornament without function," Tene said, 3 eyes staying with the skin, one measuring his face. "You build meaning until it weighs as much as a tool." They marched him on after that, down into maximum security, where a clear wall like frozen water turned a cell into a display case. David sat on the bunk, cross-legged, back to the bulkhead, letting the dark filigree along his arms breathe in the dim. The compound beyond his wall was a geometry of stacked containers and welded catwalks. Spotlights kept raking the yard. Beyond the fence, the desert rose in broken rock the wind could never quite finish. It looked like 1,000 other way stations meant to make bodies wait and minds fracture. He'd learned a long time ago that minds were stubborn clay. A hard-footed figure arrived within the hour, Commander Voss, cut from quarried dusk. Gray skin, broad frame, expression that said the mountain had already outlived you. Universal translators tended to flatten other people's names for convenience. Granite folk was what they were called by species who liked to put labels on things they feared. David Ross, Voss read from a slab of light. Detained after a failed diplomatic call in the Outer Rim. No priors. 34 standard. "That's me," David said. "What was your real assignment?" "Diplomacy." He let the word hang like a dare. Voss came close to the barrier and studied the lines with the exact same confusion David had catalogued from 100 different faces. "What do these signify?" "They're personal. Our reports say humans don't waste pain or pigment." "Everything you alter, you weaponize." David stood and stepped nearer so the commander could see how the darker lines seemed to lie under the skin and yet move when his pulse asked them to. "You want a translation, Commander?" Voss's small eyes lifted. "I do. They mean I remember. Remember what?" David put a single fingertip to the transparent wall. Under it, the marks responded, a low glow that caught and held the spotlight slit and sent it back thinner, sharper. Everything. Voss took that away with the same silence he'd brought in, only stopping at the door long enough to order 2 changes. Raise security posture, and fetch him everything the council had ever written about human cultural practices. David returned to the bunk and let his breathing find its own tide. The compound's lights kept scissoring the dark, and the wind kept moving dust like a patient scribe. The lines on his skin warmed, as if the desert night had crept indoors to sit with him. Other species called it decoration. Humans called it something else, quietly among themselves, far from microphones. A library. By morning, the doctor would peel back mystery with instruments. By noon, the commander would bring questions shaped like shackles. By nightfall, the patterns would answer on their own. And the outpost would learn what wakes when you read the wrong page aloud. They left him alone long enough to believe in quiet, then took it away. Tenay's lab was a cathedral of light and glass nested inside a shipping container's bones. Holograms hung like translucent flags. Data scrolled in ghost letters across the floor. Reed, the green guard with the 2 honest questions, stood by the door as if curiosity were contraband he might have to surrender on the way out. Again, Tenay said, all 4 eyes working in parallax. Slow breath. Don't speak, David did as told. The scanner's tone climbed until a second instrument, deeper, more patient, joined it. Lines bloomed around him in the displays, curls and lattices mapped beneath the skin, then through muscle sheets, then sketched around nerve bundles like ivy learning a wall shape. That's not possible, Tenay whispered, which in research dialect meant I'm thrilled and terrified. They extend past dermal layers. They trace vasculature and innervation in deliberate paths. She used the word deliberate with reverence. Reed shifted. Doc, the deep scanner picked up. Text. The room's air seemed to notch tighter. Tenay stabbed a command and the big projection magnified again, past tissue planes, past fibers, until the image stuttered on a grid. Microscopic symbols set within living structure, row after impossible row, as if letters had learned how to be cells and cells had agreed to keep the secret. How much? Tenay asked without looking away. In that sample? Reed swallowed. Thousands of characters. If the density repeats, millions. Tenay's secondary hands hovered as if afraid to touch her own console. Get me the linguistic engine. Priority route. I want a brute force sweep against all index scripts and compression families. They made the call. The facility's language AI arrived like weather. No visible entrance, only a difference in the pressure of the room when it began to work. It chewed the sample, rejected alphabet after alphabet, then changed tactics. Partial success, the synthesized voice announced. Encoded content exhibits multi-layer compression aligned to bioelectric gates. Not traditional text. Functions as storage and executable schema. Layers classify as historical accounts, technical specifications, narrative frameworks. Say stories, Reed murmured. Stories, the AI agreed, because sometimes a simpler word lets the mind take the next step. Tenay had asked herself, quietly, what kind of species puts their library where knives and sunlight live? She didn't ask it aloud. Instead, she said, translate a complete segment. Any segment. The lab's light grew thinner with concentration. Characters unwound themselves into rendered speech and image. The first piece came up cold and factual. A battle report from a colony that had stood under an alien sky until it didn't. Smoke, heat, weapons that threw metal and fire at shadows that drank both. A name for the attackers that translated roughly as devourers. A conclusion that translated as everyone died and somehow the memory did not. David kept breathing. He let the lab have the silence. Another, Tenay said, voice too soft for a room this bright. The next segment wasn't council history. According to the encoded record, first contact between humans and the elder powers of the galaxy had not been a treaty. It had been a refusal. The enemy wore light and called itself eternal. They insisted devotion was the price of survival. The humans said they didn't kneel. What followed was 3 centuries of math-defying war described in angles and grief. Tenay stopped asking for pieces and started building requests like staircases. She brought up star charts that didn't match anything the council had mapped. She skimmed manuals that outlined devices her physics said could not be. She read accounts of human defeats catalogued with the cold discipline of surgeons. She read one sentence twice. We learned because we could not afford to forget. When the lab's horizon ran out, she pointed every instrument. She had it the densest knot, the lattice clustered over the human heart. Even on a simple monitor, it looked different, layered so savagely that the pixels became a lie. Central focus, she ordered the array. All power. The AI hesitated. Warning. Pattern exhibits active response characteristics. Deeper analysis may trigger unknown functions. Define unknown. Autonomous modification. Signaling. Behavioral code. Reed flicked a look at David through the glass. David stared back with a patience that made Reed's hands feel too young. Proceed, Tane said. When the scan came down like lightning, the room answered back. Alarms boiled into being. The holograms staggered. Through a camera's eye, they watched the prisoner in his desert cell sit up as if woken by someone whispering his name. The lines on his skin brightened, each stroke a quiet blade drawing itself. David lifted his face toward the lens as if distance had never been invented. You wanted to know what we carry, he said, voice riding the intercom uninvited. Now you've asked the right way. In the lab, the translation header for the heart lattice appeared and Tane felt her own pulse miss. Prometheus protocol, final phase implementation. Not a weapon, she said to no one. A civilization architecture. The desert outpost spotlights kept swinging over rock and container steel. Beyond the fence, the wind changed and brought the smell of old fire. They had peeled one layer too many. Somewhere outside the compound, the night leaned in, listening for the word that would wake a species. Inside, the word had already arrived. Emergency sessions of the Galactic Council usually burned hot and brief. Fear likes to sprint, not endure. This one sprawled over days, fraying tempers into threads. Above the debating tiers, a live feed from the desert outpost flickered. A human in a clear-walled cell, lines on his skin turning night into script. Ambassador Krell paced with too many legs and not enough patience. They've placed intelligence in meat, he snapped, mandibles pinched by disgust and envy. Every human is a courier, perhaps a contagion. Counselor Nim, water breathed into Grace, lifted a translucent fin. Speculation carries weight it cannot hold. We require facts. Fact, Krell said, stabbing at the feed. The patterns contain histories of wars we never fought, technologies we never imagined, and routes to places we never charted. Fact, they did not volunteer any of this. High Chancellor Dex, not born to patience but practiced, cut the chamber down to quiet with her voice alone. Dr. Tane, report. The detention outpost's lab bloomed beside the main feed. Tane looked wrung out and awake in the same breath. Honorable Council, the scan sequence has moved beyond passive reading. The pattern over the subject's heart is active code. We're detecting quantum entanglement signatures that extend beyond our tracing capacity. How many endpoints? Dex asked. Unknown. Thousands at least. Across multiple systems. The chamber exhaled like a single lung. Even the Silicon Confederacy's harmonic speaker glitched a tone. Strategic implication. Unacceptable. Commander Voss, Dex said, bringing the granite profile into the triad of windows. Weapons implications? Our analysis suggests designs that violate present theory, Voss said. The words were flat. The meaning wasn't. Gravimetric manipulation, temporal effects, direct matter conversion. Whether those designs function in practice remains unproven. If they do, any defense we understand is inadequate. Krell seized the silence. Containment protocols. Now. Detain all humans in council space before they coordinate hostile action. Nim's fin cut the air. You would intern an entire species for the crime of remembering? Krell bared what passed for teeth. For the crime of lying. Dex let the argument run until it tried to accelerate past wisdom, then killed its engines. Tane purpose, why store this in bodies? The central lattice appears to carry a directive header, Tane said. We have a name. Prometheus Protocol. Context, existential war. Opponent designation, Eternals. The word Eternal slid across the chamber like cold metal. Old myths woke in old species. Most were supposed to stay asleep. Bring the human to a console, Dex said. Minutes later, the outpost feed cut from the cell to a secure terminal on a catwalk with chain-link railings. The desert wind bullied the microphones. Spotlights made the dust look like a weather system. David's lines had found a steady glow like banked coals. Members of the council, he said with a politeness that didn't ask permission. Ask. Dex didn't waste the courtesy. What is the Prometheus protocol? David touched his chest and the lattice there answered with a warmer pulse. It's the reason I'm talking to you from a live world instead of a ruin. When a power calls itself divine, it believes it cannot be outlived. We arranged to prove them wrong. Explain, Dex said. They gave us a choice, obedience or extinction. David looked past the console, past the catwalk, past the spotlights combing the sand, toward something no camera could hold. We chose a third thing, to become a civilization that doesn't live in cities or ships alone, one that also lives in us. Knowledge, culture, instructions, warnings, encoded, compressed, woven through biology. Burn our libraries and we'll still wake knowing the index. Are you declaring war? Dex asked. The war never ended, David said. The lights in his skin rose and fell once, and every display in the council chamber stuttered as if a finger had tapped the universe's projector. We changed battlefields. Back at the outpost, Tanay's lab drove the scan deeper. The quantum analyzers braided themselves into a noose of attention around the heart lattice and pulled. The network answered. Lines on 1,000,000 skins warmed. The first activations registered in systems with the most humans. Station habs, rim farms, embassy stacks. A trader on Kepler's orbit felt memories that weren't his arrive like rain. Blueprints, siege accounts, the taste of smoke from fires centuries cold. On military academies, cadets straightened in their bunks with sudden comprehension. In research nodes, impossible lemmas became solvable homework. Commander, Nay said, voice thin with too much astonishment to spare any for fear. We're seeing distributed ignition events across 300 systems. 200 million humans at least. How do we stop it? Voss asked. You don't, David answered from the catwalk without turning. You either learn with us or you run out of words for what we become. The desert wind threw sand like a curtain of knives against the container walls. The spotlights kept sweeping, as if motion could keep a secret from spreading. Inside the outpost, doors that had never argued with orders began to unlock at the sound of a name only the patterns knew. Outside the fence, something older than the council felt the first heat of a fire it thought it had drowned. The quantum wing sat like a steel heart deep inside the container maze, cables veining out into the night where spotlights swept smoke into silver ribbons. When David stepped into the chamber, the floor thrummed under his bare feet like something alive. Tunny watched from the glass box above with Reed and 3 other researchers, their reflections floating in the window like tired ghosts. She looked smaller tonight, as if the math had been stealing inches from her. Lie back, she said over the intercom, voice steady, eyes never blinking together. He lay on the platform. The patterns over his skin glowed faintly, pulsing in time with a rhythm the machines pretended they understood. The scanner powered up. No drama, only inevitability. A soft harmonic rose, then a second, then a braid of tones that suggested the machine was singing to itself while it worked. On the displays, David's body unfolded in layers, skin, muscle, nerve, bone. The marks didn't stop at the surface. They threaded deeper, wrapped vessels, mirrored neural paths, tucked meaning into living architecture the way smuggled blades tuck beneath bandages. Several hundred terabytes, Tnay breathed, not to impress anyone, only to give the impossible a number. Reed whispered active memory systems and no one corrected him. Data cascaded. Not list. Not logs. Experiences. The chamber's central display flashed a battle that smelled of hot metal and bad air. The Proxima report came as full-body recall. Heat, smoke, shadows that ate the light and left the sky indifferent. When Tnay told the system another, the feed rewound the galaxy and dropped her into an older memory. First contact that wasn't a handshake. The enemy named themselves Eternal and asked for worship. The answer they received was stubborn and short. War followed, long enough to grind centuries into ash. Voss arrived to the observation deck with the disciplined calm of a storm bunker. The densest knot of pattern burned under David's sternum, a map inside a lock inside a body. There, he said, pointing with the weight of a man who had run out of easier choices. Tnay already knew. Her instruments had been circling that heart lattice like cautious carrion birds. Priority translation, she ordered. The AI hesitated, the way a dog does at a door that smells wrong. Warning. Deep analysis may trigger active responses. Proceed, she said, because curiosity has always believed it could outrun consequence. The outpost seemed to feel the decision. The wind threw grit along the catwalk rails until it hissed. In the chamber, the scanner's harmonics thickened. On the deck, status hollows multiplied like mirrors. Screens daisy-chained. Diagnostics argued. Alarms arrived a breath later. Offended they'd been invited so late. A voice on the facility net said something about an energy surge from the human cell, then broke into static as the displays pixelated. Only for an instant, like a blink. David sat up within that blink. Lines burning brighter. Face turned not toward the glass, but toward whatever the glass thought it was hiding. You wanted to know what we carry, he said. Now you've asked the right way. The translation header stamped across the main pane as if forged there. Prometheus Protocol. Final phase implementation. Not a weapon schematic, but a civilization design. A plan to pour a people into their own genome so cities could burn and culture would not. Phase 1, survive. Phase 2, integrate. Phase 3, prepare. Phase 4, awaken. The plan assumed gods could smash worlds. It did not assume they could kill memory. Communications, Reed said, practically leaning through the glass. Doctor, look. The resonance metrics spiked out of chart bounds, then redrew their axes like embarrassed rulers. Signals leapt, not through wires, not through air, but through that less polite place where distance loses arguments. The AI called it quantum entanglement, because naming things helps people not scream. If true, every human was a node in a network older than the outpost, faster than the fear in this room. In the desert yard, a spotlight cut across a spill of smoke and caught nothing. Inside the chamber, David's pattern steadied from storm to tide. He closed his eyes like a door that knew its hinges. The outpost held its breath and listened for whatever came next. Down the corridor, locks that believed in procedure were about to meet a voice that did not. And outside the fence, the dark felt a warmth it remembered from a very old war. They felt it first on the far side of the stars, not in the room. Kepler's trade ring, dented panels, honest grime, watched a human merchant rest his hand on a terminal and change the mood of an entire station. Tom Bradley's skin lit to the tempo of the main bus, and the machine bent like a tired gate giving way to a familiar key. Administrative access bloomed on screens that usually took decades of clearances and favors. "Friend Tom," said clerk, his 6 hands full of worry. "Security requests all humans report." Tom smiled like a problem had finally admitted it was solvable. Every display on the ring went to the same message. Humanity is not your enemy. We fight only those who claim dominion over the free. Remain calm. Through council space, echoes propagated. On garrison stacks, human non-coms slipped into comms with a competence that felt like destiny wearing a uniform. On research nodes, problems that had been careers became mornings. In embassy cubes, ambassadors unfolded capabilities the way a host unfolds extra chairs when more guests arrive than expected. In every place the species had taken root. The patterns warmed and the quiet changed. Back in the desert compound, emergency lighting painted the catwalks the color of old blood. Somewhere below, a generator coughed and caught. "Grid failure," someone reported with the baffled anger of machinery that had been promised loyalty. Lisa Park, smuggling conviction, engineering hands, rewired a system she had never studied and made it obey. Doors unlatched with obedient little sighs all across maximum security. Prisoners, human and not only human, stepped into corridors like actors who'd learned the new script in their sleep. Voss found David in a main thoroughfare where the smoke pooled in slow eddies and spotlights drew bars across the floor. Guards stacked behind the commander, weapons raised, breath synchronized by training and fear. "It ends now," Voss said, a stone choosing the hill it will be. David cocked his head slightly, not disrespect, calculation. "My people fought 3 centuries against enemies who turned physics into a hobby," he said. "Projectiles don't frighten us." The lines across his body pulsed once like a desert heartbeat under floodlight. Every weapon answered by dying. Sparks. Silence. The smell of hot metal. The kind of quiet that arrives only after a lesson. "How?" Voss began, then stopped because the word felt too small. "We learned from very good teachers," David said, almost gentle. "Every network speaks if you speak its language. Every system can be convinced." Somewhere behind the commander, a door announced its freedom with a cheerful chime that didn't match the atmosphere. On the council emergency channel, reports piled up in Dex's queue. Shipping lanes coordinated with frightening elegance. Theoretical problems knocked down like bottles on a rail. A merchant on Kepler with admin privileges he technically didn't have telling everyone to breathe. Dex listened and did not reach for panic, only for pattern. In Tenay's lab, the analytics wall stitched together a shape from 1,000 feeds. Activations across 300 star systems, 200 million humans at minimum. The network was fully awake now, and the outpost's instruments were the wrong tools to measure it. You wanted to know what humans are capable of, David told the glass above him earlier, as if narrating the present for people who hadn't yet arrived in it. Now everyone was here. The council chamber, air recycled too many times, patience recycled fewer, argued itself raw. Containment, said some. Law, said others. Fear versus principle in the oldest debate that ever wore clothing. Dex called for analysis and heard the answer she'd dreaded. If aggression came, there was no defense that didn't begin with surrender. But aggression wasn't what the feeds showed. They showed a species rearranging the room, setting extra chairs, opening a window. Nim said as much. Krell disagreed on principle. Principle had never stopped a good panic. In the yard outside the containers, the desert wind clawed at chain link and rattled it like teeth. In the sky above the floodlights, stars practiced indifference. Inside the compound, the story refused to. The outpost thought it held a single prisoner. The council thought it faced a single crisis. By the time the sun cut the desert open, both would understand they'd been speaking to a chorus. Dex did the most dangerous thing a leader can do in a room full of fright. She asked for the truth. What is the Prometheus protocol? The answer came from a catwalk microphone half-choked with dust. A human touching the lattice over his heart and calling it by name. It's how we live through gods. Not by building bigger knives, but by becoming harder to erase. Memory as infrastructure. Culture as seed stock. A civilization poured into bodies so thoroughly that the fire would keep even if the cities didn't. He told them the part every myth leaves out. The enemy's confidence. The Eternals wore eternity like armor, convinced that time owed them rent. They demanded knees. Humans answered with spines. When worlds fell, the plan changed. The battlefield moved from space to skin. David did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Every display in the chamber flickered anyway, as if the light itself had remembered something it was embarrassed to forget. The war never ended, he said. It just moved. Below the glass, the heart lattice translation unspooled in a clean, inexorable font. Not a blueprint for a bomb, a blueprint for survival that behaves like a species. Encode everything. Spread everywhere. Sleep until called, then wake all at once. The wake word was pressure. The instrument Tenay pointed at David had provided it. Massive entanglement cascade, the facility AI reported. Because even machines resort to understatement when staring at a miracle with teeth. Endpoints beyond count, nodes waking faster than tracking, a record told through the senses of those who had lived, then died, then lived again, as story. The record bled into origin. A scout called New Horizons meeting a column of living light near Alpha Centauri, a name that said worship and expected gratitude. A captain who sent back the only reply humanity ever truly trusted. We kneel before no one. It took 307 years for the argument to reach a pause. In that time, stars moved like pawns, and human stubbornness paid in currencies the council still measured badly. But they learned. Every defeat a note, every loss an index entry, every dead hero an annotated proof. Rules can be hacked. Systems can be convinced. Even gods run on something. The chamber returned to the present with the soft cruelty of recycled air. Reports flooded. Trade routes falling into step with impossible precision, research riddles dissolving like salt, a merchant on Kepler turning system admin while asking everyone to stay calm. If they choose aggression, Voss had said, we have no defense. But the feeds again showed something else. Orchestration without conquest, assertion without blood. Nim kept repeating that in different words. Krell kept translating it into threat. Dex let both live long enough to prove themselves. Back at the outpost, Voss still stood in a corridor that smelled like scorched circuitry and desert dust. His weapons lay quiet at his boots. He did not reach for them. He looked at the man who had unmade them with a pulse and said, not without respect, "What do you want?" David's answer was simple enough to be suspicious. "For you to be ready." The lattice over his heart warmed, and the air felt a fraction thinner. as if the compound had climbed a mountain without moving. "They never left," he said into the facility net, to Dex, to the listening dark under the rocks. "They got subtle. Subtlety fails. When they act in the open again, you'll need allies who've already bled for this lesson." Across folded space, something old stirred, annoyed to find the lights on. Quantum signatures pulsed in patterns the Eternals remembered hating. They turned toward the desert, toward the catwalks lined with chain link and shadow, toward a single human standing in a corridor where smoke tilted and time felt taut. The spotlights outside kept trawling the dust as if a good sweep could stop a tide. Before the sun burned the rocks pale, a forgotten door would open where reality creases, and the outpost would learn that awakening is only the polite word for arrival. The council chamber had the brittle quiet of a place that had argued past the hour its air filters were designed for. Delegates returned to microphones like boxers to their corners. Fresh water, stale fear. Above them, the desert feed showed the outpost container maze under raking spotlights. Dust like smoke, smoke like weather. The human remained in frame or in the imagination of the frame. Either way, the lines on his skin made the dark look lettered. Ambassador Krell had worn a trench through decorum. "We do not debate a poem," he said, mandibles drawn taut. "We debate an operation. Intelligence embedded in flesh. Every human is a courier, a node, a risk we did not consent to." Nim's fin cut calm into the air. "And yet your argument requires evidence of malice you have not shown." High Chancellor Dex listened without blinking and, when the room tried to leap past its own shadow, slowed it with the only order she trusted. Facts. Tanae came through in a second window, silver skin dim with too much light. "Honorable Council," she said. "The lattice over the subject's heart is not inert. Quantum entanglement signatures extend beyond our tracing capacity." The room didn't gasp. It exhaled in one long animal sound. "How many endpoints?" Dex asked. "Unknown. Thousands at least. Across multiple systems." The Silicon Confederacy's harmonics hissed into discord. Strategy hates sentences that end in unknown. Dex widened the conversation to Commander Voss. His face entered like a cliff. "Weapons," she said. "Implications." Voss did not dramatize. "Designs that challenge present theory. Gravity manipulation, temporal effects, direct matter conversion. Whether they work remains unproven. If they do, we have no effective answer." Krell pounced. "Contain them before they coordinate." Nim's answer was the law-given voice. "You would detain a species for remembering." Dex let the argument live just long enough to prove what it was, a rehearsal for panic, and then cut to purpose. "Bring us the human. We'll ask him." The feed jumped to the outpost's catwalk, chain link rails, floodlight scars, wind pushing dust like a reluctant tide. David faced a microphone that looked older than any decision it would carry. The lattice over his heart gave the light a place to rest. "Members of the council," he said, "ask your question." Dex obliged. "Prometheus protocol, what is it?" "It's the reason I'm not Ash," David said, touching the warm geometry on his chest. "When something calls itself divine, it believes it cannot be outlived. We set out to disabuse them." He didn't raise his voice. He let the words find their own weight. "We poured ourselves into ourselves. Knowledge into code that breathes. Culture into pattern that heals. Instructions into bone and nerve. Burn the libraries, we carry the index. Salt the cities, we keep the map. Are you preparing to restart an ancient war?" Dex asked. "The war never stopped," David answered. "It only changed battlefields. For a heartbeat." Every display in the council chamber flickered. Not failure. Acknowledgement, as if light were nodding. Back on the yard, the outpost became a theater of the necessary. Doors that had never developed personalities learned petulance, then obedience. The grid coughed, failed, returned on a backup that wasn't wired to be that generous. In a security wing, Lisa Park rewrote a system she'd never studied and made it believe she belonged there. Cells parted like curtains and not only humans stepped through. Freedom behaves like an atmosphere when enough people remember it. Voss intercepted David in a corridor where spotlights made bars across the floor and the air smelled like singed metal. Guards stacked behind him, weapons ready, fingers listening for permission. "It ends now," the commander said, not as a threat but as an attempt to bargain with momentum. David gave the corridor a single pulse of light from his skin. Weapons died like a choir cut off mid-hymn. Sparks, silence. A murmured prayer from a guard who didn't know she still knew the words. "We learn from very good teachers," David said. "Every system speaks a language. We bothered to learn it." On the council net, reports stacked at the speed of a blood rush. Kepler Station. A human trader had admin access he technically didn't need and used it to broadcast. "We are not your enemy. We fight only those who claim dominion over the free. Remain calm." Research nodes. 17 old riddles fell in an hour like dry leaves. Military stacks. Movements coordinated with a grace that made admirals swear softly, either in admiration or fear. Nim repeated the obvious: reassurance, not aggression. Krell translated reassurance as strategy and strategy as threat. Dex held a line made of patience. At the catwalk microphone, the wind carried sand across steel in a long hiss. "Our fight is not with you," David told the chamber, the guards, the listening dark. "Our fight is with anyone who claims the right to rule the free." "And who defines free?" Dex asked, testing the floor. "Anyone who has to ask will learn," David said, not unkindly. "The Eternals never left. They just learned to whisper. Whispers become orders when you aren't listening. We're listening." A quiet that had been sleeping since before the Council's first charter rolled in from the edges of reality. The desert felt colder. The spotlights seemed thin. Something old had just turned to face the outpost. 400 Galactic Standard, the hour machinery prefers. The quantum wing took the cue like a stage direction. Tane arranged the analyzers in a web around the platform, each sensor a patient predator, each cable a taut line into the dark. Voss stood with a security team on the observation deck, weapons holstered because pointing them had already been declared irrelevant. "Initiate deep quantum analysis," Tane said, flattening her voice into a tool. The order went out across the facility net, bounced along catwalks threaded through rebar. David lay very still, as if the platform were a raft and stillness would keep the waves polite. The marks along his body pulsed in synchronization, a visible metronome counting down to something the room couldn't name yet. The scanners sang, not a metaphor. The harmonics interlaced rows found their standing wave. On displays, matter became map, skin, fascia, nerve, bone, each a layer of script. The lattice over the heart brightened until the pixels surrendered their lie and merely called it light. Warning banners multiplied across consoles like nervous birds. Massive quantum entanglement cascade. Connections exceeding trace capacity. Dormant nodes activating. Destinations? Voss asked. Establishing faster than we can count, the facility AI said in the professional tone of a firefighter who has learned that calm saves lives. Translation began, and the room understood why history requires witnesses. The render was not just words. It carried the taste of air and the weight of breath. It carried the ache in joints that had marched too long. New Horizons, the first ship in the account, met a column of living light near Alpha Centauri that called itself Luminar, and spoke in harmonics that went around ears and into minds. "Submit, Captain Sarah." Mitchell's reply rode on bandwidths less exotic and more enduring. "We kneel before no one." The Eternals took offense the way weather takes offense, impersonally, thoroughly. The war that followed pinned centuries to maps with fire. These were enemies who moved stars with gestures and thought in multiplications of dimension. They arrived where they wished without respecting the distances other species spent their youth learning to cross. They wore immortality as if time were a uniform. They expected devotion as if gratitude were gravity. Humans fought with what they had: projectiles, radiation, persistence. For 307 years, bodies tried to argue with mathematics. The arguments hurt. The arguments taught. Defeat is a brutal teacher and a faithful archivist. The siege of Mars rewrote the war. In a lab under polar ice, Dr. Elizabeth Chin built a crude, lethal interface to what the Eternals actually were: consciousness at quantum scale. 9 of 10 died attempting to use it. The 10th, her daughter, died too, but not before stealing the schematics of gods. Quantum drives, dimensional tools, transfer systems. Humanity shifted tactics. They stopped trying to outfight miracles and started learning how to convince them. Systems have rules. Rules can be bent by hands steady enough to take the pain. The Eternals retaliated by choosing efficiency over theater. Conversion gave way to erasure. Entire sectors went dark. Refugees flickered across a dwindling map. Fewer than 1 billion humans remained. Hidden worlds, convoy fleets, corners of the galaxy where even light traveled carefully. That was when the Prometheus protocol moved from theory to oath. Using what Chin's team had stolen and paid for in blood, human science wrote a civilization into DNA. Not only facts, but frameworks. Not only manuals, but memories. Not only stories, but the appetite to keep adding chapters. The last fleet died over a burning Earth to buy time for the upload. On the planet below, teams activated the protocol under a sky that fell in incandescent sheets. Every survivor received the modification. Children yet unborn would open their eyes already carrying a library. When the ashes cooled, the Eternals believed the lesson complete. It wasn't. The species that staggered out into the wider spiral looked diminished because appearances are useful. They traded. They married. They learned. They waited. The plan's phases were patient as stone. Survive, integrate, prepare. Awaken when the word arrived. Deep layer translation resuming, the facility AI said. The header that came next didn't feel historical. It felt like fresh ink, mission briefing, present tense. The time for hiding is over. Our enemies believe absence is victory. They remain in folded dimensions, pulling strings. Today we remind the galaxy what humans are for. Today we finish a story our ancestors dragged this far. The heart lattice pulsed, and every analyzer in the room registered a signature that instruments called entanglement because the word symphony offended their training. David opened his eyes and sat up. The glow along his skin steadied into a constant. The cameras couldn't quite white balance. Phase 4, he said, and the chamber's speakers carried harmonics that made the glass feel thicker. Awaken. Across 300 systems, hearts that had only ever been clocks remembered they were also keys, and locks began to turn. It looked like choreography from a distance. On Kepler's trade ring, Tom Bradley stood at a terminal and let the lattice under his skin listen. Admin rights bent like a reed in wind and didn't break. He didn't seize control of life support or point guns at anyone. He sent a message: we are not your enemy. We fight only those who claim dominion over the free. Remain calm. Clerk, all 6 hands of him, watched every hollow fill with the same words and decided calm was a thing he could attempt. Confidence ricocheted through corridors faster than fear could keep up. Similar awakenings became ordinary miracles. Outer Rim farmers paused over lift sprayers as star maps populated behind their eyes. Embassy staff felt treaties rearrange themselves rationally as previously impossible levers appeared in memory. Cadets woke with tactics that sometimes made their instructors smile in spite of themselves. The network that had slept did not do so grudgingly. It opened like a hand. In the desert compound, emergency lights chose a mood and stuck to it. The main grid coughed out. Then a backup stitched life support from parts that weren't designed to be friends. Lisa Park reached into a panel with the faith of someone who understands that design is merely an opinion. Locks relaxed all over MaxSec. Not just for humans. A Hive Collective detainee tasted fresh air and cried like rain on sheet metal. Freedom never arrives with tidy borders. Blood dripped from David Rossvoss's standoff ended the way all standoffs end when one side is speaking a language the other hasn't learned. Weapons died. Orders evaporated. What remained was the question he asked because there was nothing else worth carrying. What do you want? David did not deliver a manifesto. For you to be ready, he said. They never left. They learned to be subtle. Subtlety fails. When they come into the open again, you'll need people who have already bled and not forgotten why. The lattice over his heart warmed the air like a coal behind glass. The council's emergency channel turned into a river at spring flood. Shipping routes aligned as if a single hand had traced them. The Admiralty acknowledged the beauty even as it flinched from its implications. Research nodes sent up lists of solved problems with the embarrassed delight of students who finally understood what a teacher had been trying to say for years. Kepler Station's report remained the favorite. A merchant with admin access telling a nervous city to breathe. Nim used the word reassurance. Krell replaced it with intimidation because fear is a talented translator. Dex insisted on a third word, instruction. Learn what's being offered before you rename it. And then David spoke across the outpost and across the net with the same even tone he'd used since this started. We are not your enemies. We never were. We fight those who claim to rule the free. He let silence sit, then added the part diplomacy manuals never print. They are still out there, pulling string from a dimension you don't have names for. We bloodied them. They adjusted. So did we. Outside, a spotlight gathered a sheet of dust and threw it against the fence like rain. Inside, Thinny stared at a wall of metrics that had outgrown its axes. 200 million active nodes, she whispered, because nobody had asked, but numbers want saying. 300 systems. The network is fully awake. On the far side of the fold, things that had taught galaxies to kneel noticed the temperature change. The old signatures, quantum chords humanity had stolen to tune their own instruments, lit their sensors like an insult. In the depths that aren't distance, a decision was made by beings who still believed time owed them rent. They turned toward the outpost as if a spotlight had found them instead. The desert wind went from hiss to knife. The yard rattled. Somewhere a chain clanged like a bell. Reed, the young guard who had asked the first honest question of the week, looked at Tanae and at Voss and then at David, the only person not pretending the ground wasn't moving. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," David said, and the words seemed to come from the marks as much as from his mouth. "We stop pretending this is only about us." On a night built of floodlights and dust, the outpost's sky wrinkled, like paper about to tear along a fold it had been hiding for centuries. Something started to arrive. No sirens announced that kind of moment. The desert simply learned a new sound, a pressure change like weather deciding to be an ocean. Spotlights raked the yard and returned with less authority. Smoke flattened, then rose. The rocky horizon wavered as if heat had become narrative. In the quantum wing, instruments threw out warnings and then threw up their hands. Language exhausted. Numbers sincere, comprehension not yet invited. Fold disturbance, the facility AI said, which is what machines say when they are polite enough not to say door. Voss didn't bother to order weapons raised. They lifted anyway, then remembered their lesson and settled like shamed dogs. Tanae's eyes, each working a different slice of the panic, found the data that mattered. The resonance matched the signature embedded all through David's lattice. Whoever was arriving knew the song, or had taught it. On the council net, the room did what rooms do when the world changes and nobody has rehearsed. It tried to legislate physics. Krell demanded interdiction. Nim demanded breath. Dex demanded information. The feeds brought them what they could. Across 300 systems, humans stood very still as something like memory shifted from passive to active. On farm worlds, elders told children to finish their water. On stations, merchants closed shutters they had never closed. Cadets checked laces as if ceremony could anchor them. Instruction, not intimidation. Preparation, not panic. The difference, Dex understood, is whether you expect to face a storm or prove you can finish a dance in the rain. David walked the catwalk like a man moving through an old house by memory. He stopped where the spotlights made him a silhouette, and the lattice over his heart turned him into a lighthouse. "You asked who defines freedom," he said softly into a wind that carried sand like counsel. "The answer is communities that remember what it costs." He looked at Voss, stone learning flexibility, and at Tanae, curiosity holding her spine up. "You asked what we want. We want you standing when the door finishes opening." The translation that had filled the quantum wing's screens earlier returned. Not history this time, but the last paragraph of the present tense mission brief rendered in a font that looked like a fuse. "To whoever reads this, we are the children of Earth, carrying fire stolen from gods. Our enemies burned our worlds and thought the fire was gone. They were wrong. We are memory and will. We planted seeds of ourselves throughout the galaxy. Those seeds are ready. The war has not ended. It has changed form. We are coming." David didn't repeat the words. He didn't have to. The marks along his skin made the room remember them. Across council space, awakening settled into the work of being awake. Traders coordinated lanes that doubled throughput, without a single ship moving faster than safety approved. Scientists pushed proofs across the line and sent apologies to their younger selves for taking so long. Soldiers stood down from reflex and stood into readiness. Not a coup, Dex thought, watching the feeds like weather. A calibration, not empire. Not revenge, alignment, Nim said as much in gentler words. Krell heard strategy and drew breath to object. Dex let him, because democracies must practice breathing during storms. Out beyond the fence, the rocky ground carried a shadow that wasn't local to the light. The fold in the sky deepened by a fraction, the way a page bends before the hand turns it. Reed's hand found the railing and closed on it like it might have a pulse. "If they're gods," he said softly, not asking anyone in particular, "what does that make us?" "People who refused," David said. That's all the word ever needed to mean. The wind shifted. The smell of ozone layered over dust and oil and the faint metallic bite of recycled air. In the yard, a tumble of chain rattled a single repetitive stutter like an anxious clock. Tanay exhaled in a way that left room for later. Voss, who'd spent a career believing in walls and doors, stepped half a pace closer to the human he'd arrested and did not flinch. "You said we'll need allies," Voss said. "You'll have them," David answered. "We won't fight for you. We'll fight with you. There's a difference, and it changes the outcome." He looked up into the wrinkle in the sky like a sailor reading weather. "They think awakening means we intend conquest. It doesn't. It means we remember our name." In the folded dark, those who taught galaxies to kneel finished turning toward the heat they'd hoped to extinguish. Annoyance became attention. Attention became intention. The first move would belong to them because it always had. The second would belong to everyone who had learned to carry fire where rain couldn't reach. The desert held its breath. The spotlights kept trawling dust because that's what they'd been built to do. The container walls clicked and settled as if remembering long voyages. Somewhere a child, one of the outer compound workers' kids, smuggled into a corner of a barracks with a blanket and a contraband view, pressed a palm to the window and watched the sky crease and thought, "I will remember this." The door in the sky bent another degree. The first bright edge of what comes next touched the yard, and the outpost, the council, and the waiting galaxy leaned forward at the same time.